it's not just a different story. It's literally a different reality. And that's really where the power comes from, because the power is in the truth. This is not you trying to be manipulative by telling this heart-wrenching story. It's you trying to get to the truth of the matter and allow the judge to make a decision based on instead of a distorted view of reality, a more honest, truthful, objective view of reality.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, this is Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, AZ. With us today to help us get set for sentencing, another extraordinary criminal defense lawyer and friend, Patrick Barone. Now, just to set this up, I met Patrick when we were working together on a criminal case in Michigan, out of Detroit. It was a federal case, and he was handling the case stateside, and I came in to do a sentencing video and some other stuff. So we didn't know each other from Adam when we started, but we were quickly found out that we were so in sync with our process, our approach to sentencing mitigation, how we interact with our clients. So I think from the get-go, it's fair to say it quickly became a mutual admiration society. And because, first of all, it started out because Patrick was really interested in what I was doing with narrative and the ABT, which maybe we'll talk about today. But then I found out what he was doing with something, and it was something I knew nothing about. I had heard about, but really knew nothing about, and still know very, very little. But that's most of what we're going to talk about today: psychodrama. So I can't wait. And before we dig in, Patrick, I just want to give our listeners / viewers your bio. It's very long. It's very impressive. I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights. But if you want to know more, go to baronedefensefirm.com, and there's a lot more information on there. But Patrick's a lawyer of over 30 years, as I said, in the Detroit area. He handles mostly criminal, with a real deep focus on DUI cases, drunk driving cases. He literally wrote the book on it, and that book is called Defending Drunk Drivers, which he's been the chief author of since at least 2006, right? Yes. Authored or co-authored over 100 other publications. And he is a board-certified practitioner of psychodrama. And Patrick, as I said, introduced me to this in a very meaningful way. I'm trying to decide. Usually I start these, Patrick, with origin stories, but I'm so excited about psychodrama. But I'm going to temper my excitement because, you know, we are both storytellers. And so I would love for you to first just kind of tell us your origin story in terms of what sent you down the path of the law. And I kind of know this story already. I'll challenge you to see if you can do it in ABT form. But, you know, tell me how you spent your 18th birthday, man.
Well, interesting. I was not exactly a serious student when I was 18, and I was
another thing we have in common. But go ahead. Sorry.
maybe so. I was what they called at Groves High School, which is Birmingham high school in Michigan, a West Porcher, and the West Porch was the smoking lounge. So and I didn't smoke cigarettes, but I was a West Porcher. I hang out with the crew on the West Porch, and there was a new girl in town. Her name was Debbie Toko, and Debbie moved from Grosse Pointe, which is on the east side of Detroit. Groves in Birmingham on the west side of Detroit. And I was very intrigued with her. And we started dating. And this was, I think, only our second or third date. She invited me to celebrate my 18th birthday with her at a restaurant in Detroit. So I picked her up in my, I don't know what the year was, but it was a Ventura. And if you don't know what a Ventura is the I think it's the Buick version of the Pontiac Nova. The Nova was sort of the sporty version, and the Ventura was I guess a less sporty version. But this one was particularly noteworthy because it had been in a rear end collision. And so the rear end was basically like an accordion. And there was no lock on the trunk. The only way to open the trunk was to use a screwdriver. You kind of stick it in there and pop it open. And the door, the driver's side door, it was like a golden brown color, and the driver's side door was like a baby blue because we went to a junkyard to replace it. It had rusted out. We needed to put a new door on it. So that's the only thing they had at the junkyard. So I picked her up in this thing. And we started cruising to downtown, and we went to this place called the Roma Village, which I didn't know this, but apparently it was known as the place where the Detroit mob would hang out. And I also didn't know that the name Toko is notorious for being a mob name in Detroit. That was all, I didn't know that. So we go there, and I had long hair, I had long curly hair. And a diamond stud earring, which was like very popular at the time, which of course it had to be in my left ear, which is a whole other story. But I had a diamond stud earring in my left ear, but I did have a sport coat on and a tie, and she had a silk dress on. And we go walking in, and I'm ahead of her, and they ask if we have a reservation. And I didn't make the reservation, so I'm about to speak, and she sort of steps forward and says, "Yes, it's made under the name Toko." Now, I have to tell you, when we first walked in, they were definitely looking at us like we did not belong there. And I'm thinking, this is not going so well so far. But as soon as she said the name Toko, it was like, I'm telling you, it was like a red carpet got rolled out in front of us. Their attitude changed. And from that moment forward, it was like the story that you told us before we got online about the butler story. It was like having that kind of service. It was just like unbelievable. I was kind of didn't really know exactly what was going on. And then we left there after. And by the way, I also remember they asked us if we wanted anything to drink, and then the waiter looks at me and says, "No, you're not old enough to drink." But then he basically, with a nod and a wink, brings us 2 large glasses of red wine with ice in it in a like a soda glass. They were disguising it, but they were serving us alcohol. And then we drove across the border into Windsor, Ontario. And I think we took the tunnel to get there. So of course we had to go through customs and everything like that. And as we were coming, and we went there to meet some friends of mine. I had some friends that were this is totally not ABT, by the way, but I'm just telling you the story. So I had some friends there that were meeting at a bar because the drinking age there was 19, even though we still weren't 19, but we were able to get served there. And we went to this bar and we were playing pool. And then we left there to come back to Detroit. And of course we had to go through customs again. Now, I didn't know this, or I didn't think about it. But as we were driving through customs, and they're asking us all the typical questions like, "Do you have any firearms, etc." They stepped down out of the booth, which of course is always a bad sign. And they start walking around the car, and they noticed that the front license plate is different than the rear license plate, because the law in Michigan had just changed that front license plates were no longer required. So I didn't pay any attention to it. I just left it there. But it turns out, so I'm told, that this plate was registered to a stolen vehicle. So we got pulled over, we got strip searched, the whole bit. And when you end up getting arrested, they turned us over to the Detroit Police Department. And the Detroit police arrested us, brought us back to the station. And I spent most of the rest of my 19th or my 18th birthday in a holding cell in the Detroit police station. And then we got released, and I was driving home, and on our way home, and it was pouring rain like crazy. And I had bald tires because I was a poor kid. I could barely afford this car as it was. And got a flat tire, and I had nothing to change the tire. So we ended up spending several hours on the side of the road trying to sleep through the night. The following morning, I got up and called my father, came with a tire iron. We changed the tire, and I brought her home. And at least I had enough, I suppose you'd say, manners to walk into the house with her the following morning and sort of, apologize to the parents and explain what happened. And the mother was furious.
Yeah.
Basically, in so many words, she said, "Did they not know who you were?" Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So, yeah, we were sort of wrongfully accused of being in possession of stolen goods. And I spent a night in jail.
Interesting. So yeah, I'm gonna take that one step further and ask how, if at all, that shaped you. But I can't help but think about I have a wrongful accusation about that too, which was, well, it wasn't really wrongful. I was 14. It's my one arrest story. I was 14, and I had a girlfriend at the time. I won't name her name because, but anyway, I wanted to hang out with her as 14-year-olds with raging hormones do. But it was like 2 in the morning, and it was freezing cold outside. It was Indiana. So I hopped on my bicycle. I thought that was a good idea to sneak out of my house and pedal my bike a few miles up the road to spend some time with my girl. And but about a block from my destination, I saw a cop car, and the cop car had seen me and immediately turned his lights on. And of course, like any good citizen, I bolted like, I'm out of here. So I took off, but I hit a patch of ice and wiped out in almost essentially my girlfriend's front yard. And I'm in this big puff of snow, I remember, with my face in the snow, and just waiting for the cops to come and arrest me. And they did, and they threw the cuffs on me because there was a curfew law in my town. So, I was committing the capital offense of curfew violation. And got hauled down to the station over that. But let's go back to your story, because I want to know what about that story makes it part of your origin story as a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, understanding how easy it is, really, just like with your story, I mean, for all practical purposes, how easy it is to come in contact with the police. And in my case, it was completely unjustified. They were just harassing us. That's the way I felt at the time. And I have no idea what it would be like to be a minority and face that kind of harassment from the police on a regular basis, like every day. But for me, at least, I got a taste of what that was like. And I have this sense of justice. Like I there's something about me psychologically where I feel immediately an emotional response if I feel that I'm being wrongfully accused of doing anything. And it can be just a simple thing. Like my wife might ask me a question about something, just innocently wanting to know what the answer is. And I feel like she's making an accusation, and I'll respond in a negative way to that. It's that kind of emotional, I'm not sure exactly what the word would be for that, but It's part of what drives my sense of wanting to protect the wrongfully accused.
Or perhaps the rightfully accused. Because we
And
all need protection, right?
that's very true.
But
Very true.
same deal. Like the cop with that cop that pulled me over, they were not nice. It almost, my impression as a 14-year-old kid, and I honestly don't remember if I was scared or not. I was scared to know my parents were about to find out what was going on, but I remember being in the cop car and the cop said to me, "Let me see the bottom of your shoe." And I was like, "What the hell is he talking about? Show me the bottom of your shoe," he said. And I turned my leg or whatever. And he goes, "Yep, matches the treads of some burglaries in the neighborhood. So, we're going to look into that. You might end up in jail over this," that kind of thing. Like try to scare this little kid, right? Now, at the end of the day, they called my mom and dad and, they said, "We have your son down here." And my mom said, "You must be mistaken. My son's in bed." But I love you, Mom. But at the end of the day, I got punished at home, but there was no involvement in the system. And then, and what I didn't tell you is I grew up in a very, I guess you'd call it affluent, but very fucking white suburb of Indianapolis. And so the only time I ever saw a person who didn't look like me often was on the side of the road through the main drag of town when they were getting pulled over by the cops for what I assume is the offense of driving while black. Like that was it. And we'd have these rager parties and the cops would show up. No consequence for me as a kid in the suburb. And I started to figure that out. Like, there's something going on here that we're all committing crimes. All of us. Minor and major, felonies for sure. We're not killing anybody, but stuff we could have easily gone to jail for, easily gone convicted, easily changed the entire course of my life, never got into law school, you name it. But there's just two different, it seems like there were two different systems in place. But anyway, enough about me. Let's go back to you.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that because a couple things that you said really resonate with me. First of all, I have very much the same experience with being in contact with the police on numerous occasions, where certainly today it wouldn't matter the level of affluence or the neighborhood that you came from, you'd still be charged with a variety of, we'll just say, crimes. Back then, nothing ever happened. But what really made me remind me of what happened in that patrol vehicle when we were being transported from the customs office to whatever the precinct was in Detroit. Now, you may not know this, but people from this area certainly are very much aware that at the time, now this was in the early 80s. At the time, Detroit was probably, I would guess, between 70 and 90% African American, and it was not what it is today. Today, it's really experienced an amazing renaissance. But back then, I very much was like a fish out of water as far as being in the back of this patrol vehicle. I had two African American officers that were both in front, and they were making fun of us, making certain comments about how where we came from, because Birmingham, like what you're talking about, it's an affluent area, and making fun of us for being down there and trying to scare us and just putting us in the holding cell in and of itself, I think was that intimidation factor, because they really didn't have anything on us. They just had to do something. And then about 4 a.m. out of the blue, they just let us go. Never said anything. Just sort of like basically kicked us out in the rain.
Yep. So, okay. So flash forward, you're a lawyer. This is what I love about you. I've been thinking a lot about this idea between fixed mindset and growth mindset, because you were well established into your practice and very successful when you stumbled on this thing called psychodrama. A lot of lawyers who are set in their ways and think they've got it down, they're just not interested in hearing about a different way, an outside the box approach to our jobs. Don't tell me my job, I've been doing this. And then there are lawyers like you who say, oh, this is interesting. This could really help my clients. Tell me more. So tell me just give me the origin story of you and Psychodrama and how that came to pass.
Between about 1999 and about 2007, I was myopically focused on learning my craft. I wanted to be the best trial lawyer I was capable of being. So I did everything that many trial lawyers would do. I went to seminars all over the country on various elements or aspects of trial practice, how to do cross-examination, for example, direct examination, opening statements, all that stuff. And also, I spent a lot of time trying to learn the science of the law, because very often science is the foundation of the prosecutor's case. And if you don't really have a deep understanding of the science, you can't adequately represent your client or know how to cross-examine the prosecutor's witnesses, expert witnesses. So I was going to seminars probably twice a month or more, month after month, year after year. And eventually stuff started to get pretty repetitive. And I was going to cross-examination workshops, and I was learning a little bit of new things about cross-examination, but I'm like, you know what? For all the time and effort and money that it's taken me to get here and do this training, I'm not getting really the return that I was. So I was basically looking for something new. And I had an encounter with a lawyer here in a local court, and I was having sort of a conversation like this with him. And he said, well, have you ever gone to the trial lawyer college? I said, you know, I've heard about it and I know about it, but in order to do that, it's a month of time, right? You got to basically be away for a month. And he said, well, they have a new way of getting the skill set and becoming a graduate of the trial lawyer college. He said it's called the 7-step method. So what they had done, and this was like around 2007, and this was a new thing for the trial lawyer college at the time. They had taken the core curriculum that lawyers would be exposed to over that 3.5 week period at Jerry Spence's ranch in Wyoming, and they broke it down into 8 different parts. And each of those parts was then conducted over a long weekend of the workshops were 4 days each. And I'm looking at all the information and I'm very intrigued by the whole thing. And it said, in order to become a graduate of the trial lawyer college, like anybody could go to anybody who met the criteria, and you had to be you had to do one of 2 things. You either had to do plaintiff's work. You could not be a insurance defense lawyer. You had to do plaintiff's work, or a criminal defense attorney. You couldn't be a prosecutor. So if you did either of those things, you could go. So of course I met that qualification as a criminal defense lawyer. And it said if you wanted to become a graduate, you should take psychodrama first. I had no idea what psychodrama was. I didn't look it up on the internet. None of that. I just said, okay, well, that's what I want to become a graduate if I'm going to do it. So I signed up and I went to the first workshop, which was psychodrama. And I get there, didn't know anything about really the trial lawyer college, didn't know anything about anybody who would be there. And I'm looking around the room. There's about 60 lawyers. And I do what we all do, right? As you know, I start telling myself stories about the other lawyers that are there. I'm looking at them, and based on whatever I'm perceiving, I'm telling myself a story. And the story I told myself was, these are all really put together, successful lawyers. Like these are people like that perceive myself to be someone who's really trying to do the best they can at learning their craft and being an excellent lawyer. And I felt sort of apart from the group because I didn't know anybody, and I was sort of new, and I could see some people were talking to each other, some people knew each other, etc. And they started the whole 4-day workshop with these exercises, which I've come to learn are exercises in sociometry, which is a term that's used in psychodrama. It's a part of psychodrama sociometry. And sociometry has to do with the connections that exist between people, and being able to map and understand those. It's really a way to measure the connections in groups. And so they do all of these different exercises, and they would what might traditionally be called icebreakers or warm-up exercises, where you have an opportunity to make connections with other people and other members of the group. And we did that basically for the whole evening. That was what the first evening was. And then little by little, we started to learn the different pieces of what is traditionally called a classic psychodrama, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And then at the end, by the third day, we did full-blown psychodramas. And I was just completely blown away by this whole experience. Like it's hard to even express how much of an impact this had on me at multiple different levels. But all along the way, I'm like thinking, like you are probably thinking, and many people who might be watching this are thinking, like, well, first of all, what's psychodrama? I haven't explained it yet. And what the heck does any of this have to do with being a trial lawyer? Like, why are we even doing this stuff? And I'm asking myself those same questions. And then on the last day, before we were getting ready to close, they had several of the faculty members get up on the stage. This was a big room, sort of like a high school auditorium, where you've got the drama stage, which is a few steps higher than the regular floor. That's what this was like. So there was a stage that was a little bit elevated. They're up there, and they are taking volunteers from the group to basically shout out a sentence or two from a case that they know really well that they're working on right now. Different people raised their hands and they explained the case that they were working on. And then they got together, the little huddle, and they picked one of the cases, and they had the lawyer who had announced that case, get up on the stage and start to explain what the facts of the case were. And then, based on a very little of an explanation, they started to demonstrate different parts of a trial. Like one person got up and gave a mock opening statement based on the facts that they had just learned. And they had incorporated all the stuff that we had learned over the last 3 days about psychodrama. So they were incorporating these different psychodrama methods, what we call interventions, into the way that they were developing and presenting their case in court. And I'm watching this, and again, I'm just blown away. I'm like, wow, now I get it. Now I see what this is all about. And I was sold. So I came home, and my wife is a clinical psychologist, very classically psychoanalytically trained. And I started to explain all this stuff to her. And I asked her if she had ever heard of psychodrama. And she said, yeah, I understand it to be a very powerful alternative method of group therapy. I said, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know you knew anything about it, number one. And number two, I never really knew that that's really what ultimately it was. So now I'll explain, with all of that background, what psychodrama is. So psychodrama was developed by a psychiatrist by the name of J.L. Moreno. And he was a young practicing psychiatrist in the city of Vienna at the same time that Sigmund Freud was doing his thing. In fact, he was a student at the same medical school as Sigmund Freud. And there's a classic story that we learn in training to be a psychodramatist of an encounter that ostensibly took place between Freud and Moreno. And Moreno very bombastically said to Freud, his senior colleague, Mr. Freud, or Dr. Freud, you analyze people's dreams. I empower people to dream again. And what he did was, instead of the classical talk therapy where you sit down in a therapist's office, and the very classical psychoanalytic therapy, the therapist sits behind you, so you can't even see the therapist, and you're laying down and you talk. And the therapist is trained to look for patterns. And after they see a repetition of 3 things, they may make an interpretation. That's sort of classical psychoanalytic therapy. And they'll be taking notes and so forth. What psychodrama is reenactment therapy. So instead of talking to your therapist about whatever the issue is that you want to learn more about, you would actually reenact it. So for example, let's just say in your case, you talked about this experience that you had, which was a difficult foundational experience for you with the police. And undoubtedly, you have some unresolved emotional, uh, I don't know, baggage sounds pejorative when I say it, but that there's some emotion, there's some leftover emotions from that you haven't really resolved. So if you were with a trained psychodramatist and wanted to explore this issue, the psychodramatist might ask you first to tell them a little bit about what happened, like you did with me, and then might ask you if you were willing to do a piece in action, and you'd say yes. And then the next step would be to determine what the contract was with you. Like, what is it that you want to do or accomplish by having this drama? And you might say to me, well, I never had an opportunity as an adult to really tell that police officer how unfair it was for him to treat me as a child the way that he did. I was only 14. And this guy was basically being a bully. And I think I need to stand up to him because I have an issue with bullies now. Whenever I experience a bully in my life, I have this response. And I would like to explore that a little bit and try to resolve it. And I want to tell this guy off. I never had a chance to do that when I was 14. I'm like, okay. So then we would be in a group of a small group, perhaps as many as 10 or 15 people, possibly. Could be larger, could be smaller, but let's just say about 10 to 15 people. And I would ask you to pick someone in the group to play the part of the police officer. And you would pick the person and I would instruct you to pick the person in the to pick the person to play the part, not because they look like that person, but because there's just something about the person that you're selecting that in some way reminds you at a deeper level of that police officer. And it could be a man or a woman. And there might be a woman in the room, even though it could have been a male officer, there could be a woman in the room that for whatever reason is just putting out this vibe that seems to fit that role in your mind of whoever that police officer was. And you would pick that person to be the police officer. And so we would have them come up onto the stage. And I would probably ask you to set the scene. Like, okay, where do you want this encounter to take place? And because this is a drama with perhaps the possibility of a little bit of trauma, and you were 14 and you were in a disempowered state, I would want to make sure that you were placed in a powerful state when you had this encounter so that you weren't re-traumatized. And so I might ask you to bring with you in this drama someone who could be there to help really protect you. And let's just say that you picked someone from your past. I don't know, maybe your phys ed instructor because he was a big guy and taught and was the football coach. I don't know who it would be for you, and it could be anybody. It could be someone like that, or it could be a spiritual figure. It could be God. It could be a superhero, maybe Captain America, whoever it was for you. And I would have you bring that person because you're going to be that 14-year-old person again. And you need to bring someone there to help protect you from being traumatized. That's one of the ways that we do trauma-informed therapy, because the last thing I want to do is increase your trauma by putting you into this position, right? And then, so we do all of this sort of introductory stuff, and then we begin the encounter. And because the person who's playing the role of the police officer has no idea how to play that role, you have to reverse roles with them, become the police officer, and let them and demonstrate to them how to play that part. And you do it with your body language, the way that you're standing, the intonations in your voice, the things that you say. And then I reverse you back. The person who is playing that role is called the auxiliary. They become the police officer. You become dog at 14. And you would then begin the encounter, however that might be. You'd say, hey, do you remember when this happened? And I would say, well, wait a second, Doug. Let's make this first person present tense, like it's happening right now. What do you want to say to him that you never had an opportunity to say? You might say, this is so unfair. I know what you're doing. You're trying to scare me, and I'm not going to let that happen.
Yeah.
And then you say that, and then the police officer who's the auxiliary, the person who's playing that role, doesn't know how to respond. I reverse you back to become the police officer. And now you respond the way the police officer would respond. And we
He
can
would
continue.
say, well, I thought I had a responsibility to throw a little fear in you because I wouldn't want you to stray from the path, and I was really doing you a favor by showing you, how much trouble you could have gotten into, and you should be thanking me, not be angry at me. I was doing
Okay.
my job, and plus, you're the one that was out in the middle of the night anyway.
So
You could
what
have been
you've done,
hurt, young man. You could have been killed.
right, right. So what you've done without knowing it is um, you've actually expressed what we would refer to as the deeper double of this police officer. Because that police officer would never have said that to you at that time, right? That's not what he would have said.
Right.
He might have actually been thinking that at some deeper level, but he wouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
So you don't want to get too bogged down into the technique of how this actually works out, but I would remind you that is that really what the police officer would have said at this moment? Oh, no, that's not what he would have said. What he would have said was, you need to pay attention to me and do what I say, because otherwise it's going to go really bad for you, young
Right.
man.
You see this
Now,
nightstick I have here? You want to imagine how it might feel wrapped upside your head? Then
exactly.
shut up.
That's what he would really say, right? But what's behind that, we would like to think, is the police officer who's not sadistic and just getting off on the power, which is possible, right? What you're thinking is that the police officer was, at least in his mind, trying to do the right thing by instilling in you this fear so that you never actually did, progress into more criminal behavior. So he was actually trying to be more in a parental role at that moment for you, but you're imputing that into him. But
Yeah.
what you're doing though is you're learning what it would have been like to be that police officer. You're getting greater insight into the role of police officer. Now you can take that insight and bring that into the courtroom, right?
How? Tell me more.
Well, let's assume that this was a real case. Okay, this was not Doug Passon's background. This was a young man you were representing because he was actually charged, and you were trying to defend him. And let's say the charge was burglary, right? I'm not sure because we're not really working on a case. This is all hypothetical, but you might use some of what you have just believed to be true, what you have surmised to be true. There might be a chapter of cross-examination that's all around the motivation of this police officer, right? The idea that you're trying to get at is you're getting into this deeper place with the police officer. You're bringing the jury with you. You're helping the jury to understand that there might be another explanation for what was actually motivating the police officer, that he wasn't being motivated by a search for the truth. He was being motivated by something else. And that could fit into a larger narrative story that could lead to the jury then concluding that your client was wrongfully arrested. Now we're doing this in a really super condensed way.
Sure.
And I see that you're shaking your head. I think that you're kind of getting an idea of what this is all about. How much the people that are listening or watching this are being able to connect the dots, especially people who are not lawyers.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I can see
Well,
at least that you're starting to get an idea of how this all works.
yeah, and for the listener, it's very condensed because if I recall correctly, to get certified, it was 1,000 hours of training for you. So we've just condensed 1,000 hours into 10 minutes, which is fine. But now I want to talk about sentencing. Is psychodrama useful for the sentencing process?
So I have been thinking quite a bit about this topic, especially since you and I started to work together. And so the thing that I've learned, one of the many things that I've learned in my studies as it relates to psychodrama and psychology in general, is that there is a connection between this thing that we call reality, this thing that we believe that we are perceiving that we call reality, and storytelling. In fact, I am concluding, and this is not just a conclusion that I'm pulling out of thin air, this is based on some really cutting edge research that's being done by neuroscientists at this time about the way that we perceive reality and what this is that we think of as consciousness. And part of what they're concluding is that we tell ourselves stories to understand what it is that we're perceiving. So we can't really understand and maybe even perceive reality without engaging in storytelling. And I told you one example of that at the beginning of this conversation. We do that with each other all the time, right? We make a perception about, we perceive someone, and there are certain things that we notice right away, their gender, their race, etc., their age. But there are many other things about the way that they're dressed, the type of facial hair that they may have, the type of footwear, what they're wearing on their head, the type of jewelry that they're wearing, the way that they speak, etc., all of which gives us more information that informs the story that we tell ourselves about that person. And we're doing that as a way to sort of shortcut our perception of reality, right? I mean,
Let me see if I can give you an example of that, because I'm thinking about, I used to read a lot of books by Dan Millman, you know, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. And a story comes to mind about a man driving on the road, car coming in the opposite direction, and the car slows down, and it's a woman, and she rolls down her window, and she sticks her hand out, and she screams at this man, "Pig," at the top of her lungs. And the man starts telling a story in his head that she's about who this woman is and why she just shouted pig at him, and what her history with males may have been, and why she was so angry, and what, you know, what he might have done to inadvertently offend her, and all this. And as he's telling himself this story, he looks up and there's a pig in the middle of the road, and he slams on the brakes. So
perfect.
yeah.
And that happens at every level, particularly when we see something that we don't know, that we've never seen before. If we encounter something we've never seen before, then we have to tell ourselves a story about what that thing is, right? So that's the connection. Now, why am I talking about this as it relates to storytelling and psychodrama? Well, if we think about our clients from, we could go actually to the moment of their birth, or even before that, whenever you think of when their story started, to the moment that they come into our office. They're in our office, or they're calling us on the phone because they've had an encounter with the police, and they're probably either in the process of or have been accused of having committed a crime. And as it relates to sentencing, the part of the story that we really need to know, I think, is what happened before the alleged crime, and then what has happened in that person's life since the alleged crime is said to have occurred. So if you want to just sort of break it down into three parts, you've got simply stated, the before, during, and after, the during being the crime itself. Most of the time as lawyers, criminal defense lawyers, myself included, I know this is very much true of our colleagues, is we spend most of our time on the during part of the client's story. Like what can we learn from reading the police report?
Yeah.
And what can we learn from interviewing our client about what happened? Well, you tell me your side of the story. Well, that leaves out a huge part of what's important, particularly at sentencing. All that during stuff has some bearing, certainly on sentencing guidelines, et cetera. But if we really want to be persuasive and tell the client's story, that story started way before they got accused of the crime. And their story has continued since they've been accused of the crime. And if we can really delve into that part, or those parts of the story, we can tell a different narrative, which means we can change the reality of the case, particularly in the eyes of the judge who's about to sentence them. And so,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so psychodrama, I've learned to utilize the different methods and modalities and interventions of psychodrama to more deeply explore the client's story in a way that is much deeper and comprehensive than it might be otherwise. So we did this thing, I called it the deeper double, where you talked about the police officer, like what was motivating the police officer to behave the way he did. And you came up with a relatively benign explanation. And that may have been what it was. But that's what we need to learn about our client. Like, what is that deeper double? What motivated them to get to the point where they were encountered by the police? Like for you, you mentioned, well, I was a 14-year-old with raging hormones. Okay, that's part of the story. But, you also mentioned that your mom said, no, he's in bed right now. So let's face it, there was a certain amount of rebellion that was going on there too, right? So, because you snuck out, your mom didn't know where you were. Why did you do that? Well, okay, yeah. Most kids do that kind of stuff when they're kids. It's part of growing up. Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something more to it. I don't know what that was. And how does that play into the fact that you're encountered with the police right now and the way that you responded to them?
Maybe hypothetically that 14-year-old boy really felt like an outsider for most of his young life and didn't have a lot of friends and never had girlfriends. And maybe he snuck out a lot because those quiet moments all alone outside he felt his most free and his most safe and most unencumbered. And then maybe he finally got a girlfriend, which is what he's been looking for quite some time as a 14-year-old. And that was the only thing on his mind at 2 a.m. at that point. And that he was going to do that regardless of what the law said in Carmel, Indiana.
Right. So here you are defending this young man for a curfew violation, and you're standing in front of the judge for sentencing. And now, granted, this person's not going to be sent to prison. Okay, we know that. But this is hypothetical. So let's just assume that the penalty was a mandatory minimum 5-year prison term for this, right? But the guidelines in this case were, I don't know, let's just say for the sake of our discussion, crazy, 10 to 15 years. This young man's looking at 10 to 15 years, and you're trying to persuade the judge to go below the guidelines and give him a below guideline sentence.
Yeah.
Now, you could stand there and, maybe this is more typical of what a lawyer would say and say, well, judge, come on, with a wink and a nod if it's a male judge, or maybe a female judge too. We all know what raging hormones are like for 14-year-old boys. Yeah, okay, that gives somewhat of an explanation. But for you to more thoroughly explain what it was like for this young man to be growing up feeling like an outsider this entire time and really just yearning to feel like a sense of belonging for once in his life. Mm-hmm. And this young woman was someone who wasn't someone who would typically be the type of person who would actually invite him to spend any time with her. And it gave him a sense of belonging that he couldn't feel in any other way, never felt at home, never felt at school. And all he was doing, all he wanted to do was feel like he belonged.
And by the way, don't forget the show me your shoes element to this story, because if this hypothetical case goes to court and is charged and is a real offense, the government's story is pretty much always the same. You're a bad person because you committed a crime and you've got to be punished. And then they have this other stuff that they maybe can't prove, but they're going to use to suggest that I have very nefarious motivations for being out at 2 a.m, and that even though we didn't get them for the burglaries, Judge, I don't know. There's been a rash of them in the neighborhood, and I can't imagine what this kid would be doing out of bed at that hour besides that. So it's this idea about controlling the narrative that you mentioned, that if you don't tell that story of the kid, the lonely kid, with the isolation and the raging hormones, then you're giving up control and you're allowing an opening that the state can walk through with a bunch of innuendo and suggestion. And let's face it, judges want to do the right thing, but they're human, and they've seen a lot of bad shit in their time on the bench. So a lot of them may be ready to assume the worst about a person. If we don't
So
tell the best about a person, we're going to lose.
yes, and I think actually, and like I said, Doug, this is something I'm excited about because I'm really just starting. This is just starting to be formulated in my mind. Is this idea of reality and storytelling being essentially two turns of the same coin? Because um, what the prosecutor is preying on is the judge's, what I'm going to refer to as confirmation bias. Okay, the judge has been sitting there on the bench presumably for lots of years and has sentenced lots of people like you and tends to lump them all into a particular category. That's that story that the judge tells him or herself is their reality. And the prosecutor is trying to manipulate, really, the judge's sense of reality in a way that is not true. And what you are doing is telling a different narrative and therefore presenting to the judge a different reality. So it's not just a different story. It's literally a different reality. And that's really where the power comes from, because the power is in the truth. This is not you trying to be manipulative by telling this heart-wrenching story. It's you trying to get to the truth of the matter and allow the judge to make a decision based on instead of a distorted view of reality, a more honest, truthful, objective view of reality.
It's not just the factual truth, it's the emotional truth. And I think the word that keeps coming up in our conversation today that really sums it all up is connection. When it started with sociometry and the connections between people, and then you talk about the connections between reality and narrative. But I think that what we're doing is you're using narrative to connect the client to the decision maker. Because once you tell that story of this 14-year-old kid, you can start to become the other. Like, that is when the walls break down and you start to see your own story in someone else's. Because everybody's knows what it's like to be isolated and awkward and on the outside at some point in their life, don't they? And what that must feel like, and how that motivates your behavior.
Right, right.
Empathy. We're talking about empathy, right? So
Absolutely.
psychodrama is the road to empathy. Is that the takeaway?
I think that is the takeaway, and I love that. I think that's a great way to look at it, and that's what you're using. The opportunity of sentencing is to provide the judge with the information that he or she needs to have a greater degree of empathy for your client, because that's what prejudice is really all about. It's about the shortcut of making assumptions about somebody that are not true. You're prejudging that person. And it's very easy to prejudge someone in a way that makes them other than, to make them different from you. And it's very easy to not like people who are different than you. And what psychodrama does, going all the way back to my story about standing in this room with all of these people that I felt very much different from, what I felt like at the end was that these people were all like me. Why? Because we had all shared personal stories about ourselves that allowed us to see the connection between us in a way that we could not have ever perceived had we not done that work together. And because of that knowing, I feel more at home. I feel more at home with virtually everybody, because instead of me looking at a person and trying to see what's different, I look at the person and assume that we have the same essential parts of our background. We have the same struggles, the same traumas, the same disappointments, the same joys. And we're all
Uh,
human beings. We're all part of the same human experience.
well, I think that's a lot of what the world could use right now, especially in this country. By the way, I had a very similar epiphany, like literally yesterday when I was thinking about storytelling and Make America Great Again. And it's not my political views. Obviously, I'm a flaming liberal, in case anyone hadn't already figured that out. But you know, and it's easy to get angry that people buy into a lot of that stuff because on its face it seems racist or xenophobic or whatever you want to label you want to put on it. But then I realized something. The most of the folks that buy into that are reacting exactly as we would want them to and expect them to when we tell a really powerful story. And that's all. I mean, for all the last guy's faults, and there are many, he's a master storyteller, and he's just so good about boiling it down to its essence. And when we tell this great story, it really does go to work on the brain and this almost subconscious level, and that's how we hook people in. And that's how we persuade them. And that's how we motivate them to do what we want or what we need them to do. So I've sort of started to feel like connected to those folks before all I felt was different from them and mad and say, you're just being a human being, man. Like that's how you're supposed to react. I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with you. And by the way, if you're putting on, khakis and lighting your tiki torch, I'm going to have a bigger problem. But if you're just subscribing to the rhetoric, I don't blame you. I don't fault you. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
a tangent. I want to get back to sentencing and psychodrama because I think there's another thing we got to talk about why this is important, which is either allocate a major aspect of sentencing is making sure the judge understands your client not just accepts responsibility for what they've done, but shows genuine remorse and contrition. And it's not just about putting on a show and saying, I'm really sorry for it because the judge has heard that a million times. It's about communicating to the judge that this person truly gets it. He's truly sorry. And the takeaway, the therefore, is that means he's never going to do it again. You're never going to see this person before you again. The person that did the bad thing is now a different person. And so can psychodrama help with that process, especially for our clients who may not understand exactly how to be the best communicators in that crucial moment?
Yes. So what I tell my clients, and this is, I think, a different way of saying exactly what you just said. What I tell my clients is, look, I am the stereotypical or proverbial mouthpiece. I'm the hired gun, right? You paid me to go in and talk for you. And whatever you would say to the judge, I can say it for you. But it's not going to have the same impact on the judge unless it comes from your mouth. Because the judge can actually do what we all do. The judge is basically paid to do, which is to judge you. And the way the judge is going to be judging you is by watching and listening. The way that you speak, the way that you hold your body, the intonation, the emotion, whatever it might be, the emotion that's behind the words. And I can't replicate that for you. So if you're able to, it would be much more powerful if you made your sentencing statement rather than have me make it for you. So I sort of start with that premise. And then the question is, how do we get the person to make the kind of statement that is going to accomplish what we've been talking about? And all of us, myself included, of course, we have defenses, psychological defenses, by which I mean ways that we try to protect ourselves from being hurt by other people, hurt emotionally and sometimes physically as well. But in this case, I'm talking about emotionally. And some people that are so much alienated by society, the only way that they can feel safe is to separate themselves and become hermits. Sometimes that's one of the problems with people that are living on the street, is because they so can't fit into society. And if they try to fit into society, it always causes them to feel emotionally hurt. The only way that they can avoid that is by being away from, to sort of be at the margins. So it's always the biggest challenge is to sort of break, especially with certain types of crimes, and people that commit certain kinds of crimes have very well developed defense mechanisms. And we probably have all had experiences where we are observing on television, popular media, maybe in person, whatever it might be, someone who was in a gang at some point and now has been through some type of rehabilitation, maybe a 12-step program, whatever it might be, and they've really turned their life around. And they come across as this sort of gentle, really kind-hearted person. And they might be telling you their story, and they're crying. They're like sobbing like a baby. And you're thinking to yourself, how can this person who I'm perceiving being this vulnerable, how could they have been in a gang? Because your perception of being a gang member is, someone who's tough and who would never express that kind of emotion because it's a sign of weakness. Well, all of that reluctance to express the emotion, that's a defense. Because if you express that emotion in the gang environment, you're going to get kicked out of the gang. You might be you could be killed. Certainly, you're going to be excommunicated. So the question is, how do we break through their defenses? How do we get them to actually be honest, first with themselves, and then secondly with us? And there are different ways to get the person to trust you enough to be able to actually go there. So that's the first part of it, is to get a feeling of trust with them, which hopefully you have as their lawyer, but sometimes there's still a certain amount of skepticism that you're part of the system, whatever that might be, that you're not really looking out for their best interest. They see you over there talking to the prosecutor and maybe you're laughing and you're like, those two are probably laughing about me right now, whatever it might be. You need to make them understand that, I really am here for you. And in order for me to help you, you need to be honest with me, and maybe in a way that you've never been honest with anybody, maybe not even yourself. And part of what helps that to happen is self-disclosure, to explain to the client something about yourself that's vulnerable. Because typically, if you are being vulnerable, a person will mirror that back and be vulnerable with you. So that's a way to sort of break the ice, so to speak.
Which is so counterintuitive to what we're taught. We're taught so wrongly in law school and everything else, which is don't get personal. This client is not your friend or whatever else.
Right.
That's a brave leap. That's an
Right.
outside the box approach.
So the question is, how do we break through the resistance? And I can't tell you that there's a one size fits all, because there's not. But one thing that you and I did together, Doug, that I've used before that can be very effective is to get the person a little bit outside their head and to put them into a safer place by having them write a letter to someone, for example. Now, it's helpful to have them write a letter about what happened, maybe what happened to them, or how they feel about what it's been like for them to be in the position that they're in now, et cetera. Maybe they're writing the letter to a younger version of themselves. Like, what if you were to write a letter now, Doug, to that 14-year-old young Doug? I don't know if you had a nickname back then or whatever it might have been, Dougie. If you were to write a letter to young Dougie about that experience, what would that letter sound like? And
so first of all, I hated being called Dougie as a child. Now everyone calls me Dougie, but that's an aside. But yeah, go ahead.
So that's just one example.
Yeah. How about putting yourself in the shoes of the person that you wronged, the victim?
That can be very powerful as well. But again, that has to be done very carefully, because there could be some level of trauma in doing that. Also, it can be helpful to have the person, instead of speaking as themselves, speak as someone else. Like if they have a deceased parent, have the deceased parent write them a letter about what happened and why they think that they're in this position. Or it could even be pick an object in that person's home, particularly an object that has some cultural significance. So for many people, it could be a Christmas tree, because they remember the whole the whole family tradition of putting the Christmas tree up, and then what it was like to have that Christmas tree in the house, and you could reverse roles with the Christmas tree, because that Christmas tree, played a particularly important role in this person's life. What would that Christmas tree have to say? Or maybe there was a piano that was in the room where they typically would hang out with their parents or with their family. And that piano, whether they played it or not, that piano was just like a piece of the family history that was always there. So that piano knows things about what happened in that house and knows things about what happened to this person that maybe nobody else knows. Have the piano write them a letter. See, that gets them into a different place. It's safer to do it from that perspective than to do it from their own perspective. And that can break through the resistance. And there's a whole bunch of different other things that can be done as well. But the whole idea here, Doug, of course, as you know, is to be able to get into that vulnerable place and to learn that person's story in a way that you would not be able to learn it. There's no other way that you would be able to learn it. And then be able to use that as a way to explain to the judge what the real reality of this person's life is, not the reality that the prosecutor wants them to believe to be true, or the reality that the judge may impute to that person based on their own experiences.
So I got a question. I know you can do sort of an abridged version of it because we've done it together with a client, but I know that also that is far from the ideal and that it actually can be dangerous. And it's what's the ideal in terms of how long you would like to spend with a client, getting them to wherever you're trying to go? Is there an ideal or ballpark?
Well, I mentioned Jerry Spence. Jerry Spence is, of course, the person that founded the Trial Lawyer College, and he's one of the first lawyers that I know of, at least, that came up with the idea of sort of synthesizing psychodrama and what happens in the courtroom and trial preparation as well. And he says, as a rule of thumb, for every hour that you spend in the courtroom, you should spend a minimum of 10 hours in preparation. So if you think you're going to be talking to the judge for an hour, then you're going to be spending 10 hours with your client preparing for that sentencing.
Wow.
Now, would I actually do psychodrama for 10 hours? That's a lot of psychodrama for one person.
Yeah.
But I might do an hour or two
Yeah.
with the client.
Well, that's a good ratio, especially, I mean, if you think about most sentences are shorter, a lot of them are 10, 20 minutes. So why not spend 2 hours that's the very least you could do to learn their story. But you know what I'm thinking about, and the reason why I asked this is because where I think this would be so amazingly important is in capital cases for mitigation, the penalty phase. But what's happening in a lot of these cases is there's a trial and it lasts a few months, and the jury is just basically silently judging them the entire time with their body language and the way they respond to testimony and all this, and they're making a determination about whether they have remorse. And these clients need to be conditioned to be in a mindset to where they're going to react in a way that's appropriate to what's happening in the courtroom and set the stage because remorse is one of the biggest factors in whether someone gets the death penalty or a life sentence. So I think it's time for Patrick Barone to start doing capital cases. Maybe you already do.
And the first thing that I think of when I hear you say that is you're spot on. And I know a lawyer in Florida that does nothing but mitigation on capital cases, and he has this kind of training, and I know that he utilizes it in his own practice. But the second thing is that someone who is accused of that kind of a crime is undoubtedly going to be a person who has a very high level of resistance at all different levels. One of which would be if they did commit the crime, and presumably they did, either the jury, because the jury believed that they did, or because they confessed to it, then they at some level feel what almost any person would feel after having taken another person's life. And most of us have had an experience in our life where we have felt really uncomfortable emotions. And one one method that we might use to protect ourselves from those emotions is to push them down so deep that we ignore them, right? And so trying to access those emotions is really, really, really scary. And there's a lot of resistance to doing that because you're afraid of what might happen if you actually look at what those emotions would feel like. And you just think that you might not even be able to survive feeling that level of emotion. So how do you get someone to break through to the point where they can actually access that enough to be able to not look like that stoic person with no expression on their face who seems to be completely remorseless, but actually is so deeply remorseful that it's the only way that they can survive from day to day is by suppressing that so far down that nobody can see it, including themselves. And maybe they've even denied it to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. So we could keep going, but I know it's time to wrap up and let this hopefully be the first of many great conversations we have together on Set for Sentencing. There are a lot of takeaways, but the note that I love to end with is don't let, it's back to this growth mindset. A lot of people say, I don't know, psychodrama, it's touchy-feely, it's not for me. It's too different. I'm very uncomfortable by this. And my answer is good. I want you uncomfortable because I want you to disrupt. We know that our system is not functioning the way that it needs to. And the only way we break through those walls by really cool, outside of the box, creative advocacy. And that's what you're up to. That's what creativity is. It's the gap between what is and what should be or what could be. Creativity is hope, and you bring a lot of hope to your practice and to me, so thank you. I appreciate you. If anybody wants to know more about Patrick Barone, again, go to Barone Defense Firm, Barone defensefirm.com. Where can we get the book, the DUI book, and anything else? What else do we need to know about you before we sign off?
The DUI book is James Publishing, but you can just really search defending drinking drivers, not drunk drivers. It's
drinking
drivers.
Words matter.
and you'll find it. And also, one thing we haven't talked about, I might as well plug it, is the Michigan Psychodrama Center. My Dr. Elizabeth Corby and I, is trained, she's a trained clinical psychologist, but also a trained trainer, educator, and practitioner of psychodrama. She and I got together in 2014 and formed the Michigan Psychodrama Center. And we offer workshops. We have a workshop coming up this July in northern Michigan, and we're going to be working on what's called shadow work, and it's bound to be really, really intense. And a great experience for anybody who's willing to really take a deep plunge into all of this stuff. So we do offer psychodrama training as well, and sometimes trial lawyers come to our workshops.
Is there a website for Michigan Psychodrama Center?
MichiganPsychodramaCenter.com.
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, I'll put that and everything else in the show notes so people can check that out. And okay, thank you, Patrick Barone, for coming on Set for Sentencing. And I look forward to keeping the conversation going. And I know you're going on vacation soon, so have a good one.
All right, Doug, thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to doing it again.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.